Cause number one, Joe's personality is a spitting image of George Costanza.
Hello everyone, welcome back to For These Are My Thoughts. I'm Blake. Thanks for joining me. If you're new to For These Are My Thoughts, our goal is to help you laugh and relax. This past New Year's, I had the blessing and privilege of being the best man in my good friend Joe's wedding. It was a groovy time. Thank you to Joe and his new wife Hillary for letting me be part of your big day. One of the biggest and most well-known parts of being a best man is the best man's speech. And I gotta say, I crushed it. Even Joe, the groom, said that it was the greatest best man speech that he has ever heard. The speech it seemed a big hit. People laughed, and so I thought that I would share with you the biggest tips of giving the best man speech. I'm going to give these tips in sequential order, and tip number one is ask the groom what he wants or expects from your speech. I actually can't take credit for this tip. Joe was the best man in my wife Hannah and I's wedding back in 2019, and he asked me what I wanted or expected from his best man speech. And so I thought that I would return the favor for Joe, and it was the best idea. When I asked Joe told me,
I do not care what you do, what you say, or how long it goes. I want you to roast me, and I want you to make me laugh. So as we start the speech tonight, two things. Number one, if you have any complaints, direct them to this man right here. And number two, strive it with the clean year to the new year. Hope you don't have any plans.
that was huge for me being able to write the speech. Knowing exactly what Joe wanted and expected gave me more clarity when writing out the speech. Asking the groom a month or two in advance helps you in ways that you would never even imagine. For me, knowing that Joe wanted to have a funny speech, wanted me to roast him, didn't matter how long it went, really allowed me to dive into the writing process. Tip number two, when you actually sit down to write your speech, make sure that you have a few killer opening lines and some good kind of starter jokes. Having a good opening line is a must for a best man speech. Let me explain why. If we take a journey down to hypothetical theoretical land for a second, think about yourself at a wedding reception. You're at the head table, you're the best man, and you're watching the maid of honor give her maid of honor speech. If you had to bet, if you had to assume, that speech is most likely going to be sappy, have a lot of tears, and end in some kind of overly sentimental statement or cry fest. So you, as the best man, need to kind of get the crowd ready for your speech, even if it isn't a full-on comedy or funny speech like mine was. You definitely want to lighten the mood, get people ready for your speech, for the stories that you will probably tell. And so the best way to do that is to have a killer opening line.
You know, today, as I walked down the aisle, all I could do for myself was, wow, I wish I had a program to block the glare off of Joe's head right now. I'm sure Henry looked great, but as I can see now, she does, and Joe, you look okay.
After you give your really good opening line, you introduce your speech a little bit, you also need to have a few kind of starter jokes to prime the pump for the rest of your speech. For example, I use some starter jokes like this.
Joe reminded me that he had an event on the football field in fourth grade. Joe remembers it well because he was depleted and had his back on the ground a lot. And then Joe and I, after college, lived together for an entire year. And I learned more about Joe than I ever wanted to know.
Have some good jokes, some good opening lines, some funny things to say to start your speech, to get people in the mood. It doesn't have to be full-on comedy. Again, my speech was because that's what Joe wanted, so I had a lot of jokes to start the speech. You don't need a ton of jokes, but you should have at least 2 or 3 good ones that you can use to get the crowd laughing and get them kind of on your side for the rest of your speech. Now, tip number 3 goes back to kind of the writing process of things, and that is to have some kind of framework or some kind of premise to your speech. So after I talked with Joe and found out that he wanted a funny speech, he wanted me to roast him, didn't care how long I went, I came home and knew that I needed a framework to hold all of the jokes, all of the stories, everything I was going to try and do in the speech together. If you just kind of throw crap out there, it's gonna sound like crap. If you give a speech that is just a bunch of jokes at the groom's expense, you're most likely going to upset someone that you shouldn't. Maybe the groom, maybe the bride, maybe the groom's parents, maybe the bride's parents, maybe everyone in the room, and you don't want that. Again, you want to have a framework and premise for the speech to kind of support your jokes so that people know that it's just good fun. For myself, I thought that the funniest way that I could tell jokes about Joe and have a little bit of sentimental value was to do a pros and cons list of living with Joe. So here is how I set up the framework of the speech during the speech.
So I thought that it would be fascinating. It says the two of you in the next 2 years will live together permanently because of residency. Hillary, I thought it would be good to give you a pros and cons list of living with Joe.
The general framework of my speech is a pros and cons list where there are a bunch of jokes at Joe's expense, a bunch of stories that Joe and I have together, and there are certainly nice things sprinkled in, but it all had a purpose. And the purpose was to help his wife, who is not necessarily going to live with Joe right away because of residency and living in 2 different cities, be prepared for living with Joe. You and I have probably seen on the internet, maybe even in person, a best man speech where it just seems like jokes are made for the sake of telling jokes, almost like a stand-up routine. A stand-up routine is not really a best man speech. Having this premise of a pros and cons list allowed me to say some nice things about Joe, tell some jokes, and make it all about his lovely wife all at the same time. And remember, while you may have the mic, it's still about the bride and groom on their wedding day. Tip number 4 is write your speech in advance, practice it, and rewrite it often. This is huge, especially if you're planning on telling a bunch of jokes like I did. Writing your speech a few months in advance, I wrote my speech 2 months in advance, and then I practiced with Hannah in the room so that she could help me with the jokes. That is huge because it will help you know what jokes are actually funny, what jokes are awkward, maybe they're inside jokes that you don't want to tell, or maybe they're jokes that could come across as mean-spirited. Again, I practiced my speech in front of Hannah multiple times, and she helped me take out some of the jokes that weren't funny, and she helped me reword others so that they weren't mean-spirited, didn't seem like just kind of mean jabs to Joe. For example, in my speech, again, I had a pros and cons list, and the first con was this.
Con number 1, Joe's personality is a spitting image of George Costanza.
That joke could have gone downhill really quickly, but Hannah was able to help me reword and word some jokes so that it didn't seem like I was just badgering Joe for having a bad personality. It was just me making some jokes at Joe's expense that everyone would understand that were funny. They were lighthearted. People were able to tell I was telling jokes. And here are some of the jokes that I told about Joe being just like George Costanza.
George is known for being opinionated, loud, occasionally aggressive, and very easy to fluster. Enter Joseph Francis Novak IV. Joe is not afraid to share his opinion. When George started living here, Joe told me that he was the best cook. He was a far better cook than I was. I never seemed to see Joe eat more Taco Bell, McDonald's, or Pizza Hut than
key. Rewriting your jokes and tweaking your speech so that it's quick and it's also well received. My best man speech clocked in at about 11 minutes. Again, Joe didn't care how long I went. He wanted it to be funny, and I knew that in order for it to be as funny as possible, it needed to be a little longer. The average best man speech is about 3 to 4 minutes, so make sure that you rewrite it often so that it's not just quick, but it's well received. And again, that means writing it in advance. Don't be that guy that writes his speech the night before the wedding. That rarely turns out well. Writing your speech in advance allows you to know what you're saying, right? You can have it kind of memorized, not fully. I had my notes with me, but you can have it kind of memorized and having the timing of jokes down just right. Here are a few of my favorite jokes from my speech.
As you heard Joe's dad say, Joe has a massive, infectious smile, and that occasionally makes him look like a muppet. And con number 2, this is maybe my favorite con joke, is that Joe is a noisy eater. One night, Joe and I were watching The Simpsons, and all of a sudden, I start to hear this noise. And if you're confused as to what that noise is the same noise that Homer Simpson makes when he eats a donut. And it wasn't coming from the TV, it was coming from my friend Joe. Every bite of every meal, every day, for a year, I heard, something that Joe and I have in common is the love of comic books and superheroes. I like to buy comic books and actually read them, put them on the shelf and read them again. Joe likes to buy comic books and hide them behind plastic like the prospect from Toy Story 2. Never read it all again. And one time Joe had a comic that I very much wanted to read. And I asked Joe, I said, hey, can I read that comic book when you're done? He said, okay, sure. I need you to wash your hands first. That's right. Joe treats his comic books just like a new mother with her firstborn child. Wash your hands before you touch my gentle baby.
All of those jokes were rewritten multiple times. Some of them I did add the night before, but I added them after talking with Hannah, after talking with some of my friends, and making sure I had the wording down just right. Tip number 5 is a huge tip, especially if you're going to tell a funny speech, a speech where there's a lot of jokes at the groom's expense. It does seem a little basic, something that you probably already know, and that is to end with nice things. No matter how funny your speech is, how many jokes you tell, what kind of speech you give, make sure that you tell nice things at the end. Say nice things about the groom, say nice things about the bride. My speech was filled with jokes. And so I knew that I needed to say something nice about Joe so that people in the room that maybe didn't know him as well knew that he was going to be a good husband and is a good husband for Hillary. So here are a few things that I did at the end of my speech to make sure that people were reassured.
And now there is one final row, and that is that Joe is a caring, compassionate, and joyful guy. Now I feel like this is something you know Hillary, but since I just said a minute ago that Joe is just like George Costanza, I feel like you need to reassure your family that Joe's okay. Joe's dad mentioned this, I was going to mention it, because Joe told me nothing's happening. But Joe's dad mentioned I was always floored in high school, or I was floored as a freshman in high school. Joe shaved his head bald for his aunt. That is one of the most, that is the most, and still to me is one of the most caring and compassionate things someone can do for another person.
End the speech well. Give them maybe a funny toast. I gave a funny toast at the end.
So I have 2 toasts. If you wouldn't mind raising your glass to the first one. The first one is to you, Hillary, because you have to live with Joe. Our thoughts and prayers are all with you.
But if you do that, if you give that funny toast at the very end, make sure that you have a follow-up toast that is nice afterwards, like this.
The second toast is less sarcastic. And it is to the love you make your lives together continue to be filled with love, joy, and compassion. Most specifically, the love, joy, and compassion of Jesus.
If you just kind of end your speech with a story that embarrasses the groom or is just kind of crude or whatever, if you don't end the speech well with a nice toast, everyone's just gonna feel kind of awkward. So make sure that you end your speech well, end it with some nice things, a good story about the groom, and everyone will be happy. Doing these tips can only help you have a great speech. I know some of you may have other tips for giving a really good best man speech. So if you have other tips on giving a good best man speech or maid of honor speech, make sure that you comment those below. Thanks for watching. As always, if you enjoyed the video, if you laughed, if you find yourself relaxed, please make sure that you like the video, subscribe, follow us over on social media. Until next time, these are my thoughts, and I'll see you soon. Thanks again for watching. Use the circle button to subscribe to the channel and become part of the think tank. Click the left box to watch more episodes from this season of For These Are My Thoughts. Click the right box to watch a For These Are My Thoughts episode chosen just for you.